So thank you very much for coming today. Now you live in Seattle.
True.
And you live in Connecticut.
New Haven.
So when you traveled here, did you worry about your carbon footprint?
I did. I asked myself, what possible good could I be doing here today that would offset that carbon? And I'm counting on all of you to do things which will make it so that it was a good idea for me to take that airplane.
Right? And did you worry about your footprint?
I have to say I didn't. I was more worried about this.
Okay, all right. So we're going to talk today about two subjects, really. One is the environment and your family's connection with it, and one is intergenerational philanthropy. Let's talk about the environment for a moment. So Gifford Pinchot was your grandfather.
Correct.
And when you were growing up, when did you realize that he was a famous environmentalist and had done a lot of things that were very important to the country?
Well, when I was quite young, and I don't know exactly when this was, I would meet adults, and I would say hello, and I would say my name is Sandy Pinchot, but they knew that I was Gifford Pinchot, and all of a sudden, the conversation switched to somebody else. So I felt I had no identity in a way, because I was just someone who was named after someone as opposed to a person in my own right. When I got older, I found that being a Gifford Pinchot actually gets you in places that you might otherwise not get into, so it became more valuable. For example, I wouldn't be here tonight.
Well, and when did you realize you were from a famous family?
Well, it's a complicated story because my mother was the Pinchot, so the name wasn't as vivid. However, we went every summer to the Pinchot family homestead in Milford, Pennsylvania, where it was a famous name. My mother was not a conservationist. We lived in Washington, D.C. My father was a journalist, so we lived in a different world. It was only later when I moved to Milford, got involved in conservation stuff, and began to see how other people saw it. We didn't really focus on it.
So I should have said that your grandfather was Gifford Pinchot, and your grandfather was Amos Pinchot, who was the younger brother of Gifford Pinchot. And while Gifford is better known in some respects because he was the head of the Forestry Service, among other things, your grandfather was pretty involved as well. You might describe what he did.
Well, he was a radical in his soul. He saw things whole and saw what needed to be done, which I would say is true of Gifford too, but he was slightly to the left of Gifford, at least in the beginning part of his life. And the threat of the growth of capitalism as a force, especially as it was being played out in the 19th century, was something he was deeply aware of. It kind of hit him hard. And he and Gifford together were part of the group of people who founded the Progressive Party in opposition to this monolith that was taking over the government, that was taking over, resources. And so he, over time, grew more and more radical. He had pretty much the idea that the important resources should be owned by the government and the people. This went farther than Gifford was willing to go, farther than Teddy Roosevelt. You have a sort of trio of the three of them at different levels of radicalness. And then he went into the anti-war movement during World War I, and that's where he got very involved in civil liberties and helped to start the ACLU. So he had a different focus,
right.
But the overriding thing, I just want to say this one thing, which is that there was a sense that you couldn't attack the conservation problem unless you looked at the monopolies and the big interests that were controlling things. And so that's where the two of them joined forces on slightly different areas.
Okay. So when you were growing up, at what point did you think that it would be a violation of your family's tradition if you did something like work for ExxonMobil or did something like that? And did that propel you to go into the environmental area, or you didn't really care about your family's background when you were deciding your career?
I guess I was sheep-dipped in the environmental movement at a very early age, so it never occurred to me that it wasn't my job to do something to make the world a better place. Living in the shadow of my grandfather, that was a pretty high hill to climb to try, and obviously I failed. But to be in a family that expected you to do great things in conservation was something I never can remember not having that as a strong part of who I was as a human
But
being.
your earlier career was really in civil rights, is that right? You spent a lot of your time in the civil rights area?
Well, but civil rights is also part of my family's legacy
Right.
because, first of all, conservation itself was preserving the resources of the United States for the common people. And so my grandfather did a lot of things in the area of
Right.
trying to make ordinary people, what he called plain people's lives better. And I think it was natural that when I saw the Freedom Riders going down that I had to do something about it.
Okay. So like, let's suppose your children had said to you, you know, I really want to, you know, be a coal mine owner, or I really want to own a lot of private jets. What would you have said?
Well, we did have one sort of like that.
Oh.
And he was a Republican to the core in a Democratic family. He wanted to be in business. He wanted to make a lot of money. This was pretty anathema. And he's in fact living in Dallas, Texas, working for an investment firm. But he's an environmentalist also, because you cannot not be in our family. It's just that it's a little harder from where he sits.
So we might describe what was so unique. You know, many people would say, well, the environmental movement began in Earth Day of 1970, but actually it began many years before, generations before. What was so unique about your grandfather? What did he do with respect to the forestry concept that was unique in terms of preserving forests? Why was it so unique at the time?
Well, part of it was setting aside the land, which are the national forests and many of the national parks today. But part of it was also a very successful PR campaign. He was he had, even in the very early days in government, he was basically running a PR function to sell the idea of conservation to the American people. And I think that was important. I think there's a couple of other things that he did which are good strategies. One of which is forming institutions that are going to have an important impact. Yale Forestry School is one of them, but there are many others, journals, conferences, associations, and so forth. So if you look at that as a strategy of how to use your money, I think that's important. And if I can say one more thing. Sure. I think that another thing that was unique about him among philanthropists is that not unique, but an important lesson, is that as a second generation person, what do? You know, the first generation has supplied the money. Now you're going to go out and do something. And what he did was he chose a place to stand, in this case, preservation of forests and conservation in general. Right. And then he became an expert in it. And then he was active in it. And his biggest contributions were not of money, although he made contributions of money to all the things which he was doing. His biggest contributions were because of the fact that he had adopted a cause. And I think as a second generation person, you know, you're standing in the awe of your forebears who made the money. You've got to do something that's going to lead to self-esteem. And so my advice to the second generation is to focus, choose an issue, take a stand, learn a lot about it, and get active in it. Don't just sit in the family foundation board and give money.
Okay. Well, it's often said that, you know, it's for expression, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, which means that somebody starts with no money, the next generation makes money, the next generation loses it all. So your generation, how did you avoid losing all the money?
Didn't. When I was 40, I had a business failure. I was broke. I owed the bank $80,000. The interest rate was 23%, and I was an unemployed blacksmith with 3 children. So that was an interesting time. When I first got a job, I was...
Ever consider running for president of the United States or anything like that? No, never. No.
Fortunately, you know, I had success after that, both in the consulting business and then later in the internet security business. Okay. I sold a company in '98 that we founded, and so that gave me money for renewed philanthropy, and I've pretty much gotten rid of that as well.
Well, when you were having your financial problems, you didn't go to people and say, well, don't you know who my grandfather was, and you should, you know, be easier on me? It doesn't work?
You know, I think that's really an interesting question, and I think that one of the mistakes I've made in my life is that I haven't used family connections as much as I could have. And again, for the young people in the audience, I want to say, your parents probably have a lot of connections now. Many of those connections are even older than they are. If you wait until you are 40 to begin trying to exploit those connections, they will be gone. And so I think that we're engaged in fights like climate change and the environmental issues of today, where we have to use everything we've got. When Gifford was a young man fighting for a position in the world, his parents supported him not only financially, but they supported him by saying, well, who do you need to know to get this done? And then they would invite them to dinner, and they would sit around and chat about the issues. And I think that kind of relationship between the generations is really interesting. And I would not hold back on using, if I were to do it again, I would not hold back on using family influence in a powerful way.
Now, your grandfather, as you mentioned, is the head of the Forestry Service, a very famous environmentalist and so forth. Was your father involved in this area, or was he a regular businessman?
My father was a physician and a biochemist, but he was on the founding board of NRDC and Environmental Defense Fund. So he was very active in a more standard philanthropic way. He also did a bunch of testifying and that sort of thing.
So what are you focused on now in the environment in terms of making the environment better? You live in New Haven, which is where the Yale School of, now it's called the Yale School of Environment?
School of Environmental Studies, yeah.
Environmental Studies, okay.
Before I do that, I just want to go back to the generation before Gifford, because I think there's a story there that's really interesting and tells us how Gifford came to be, how Gifford and Amos came to be.
Okay.
And that's James Pinchot, who was a first generation Frenchman. He came here and came to New York City and made his money in wallpaper. But at the same time he was doing that, he was captivated by painters, Hudson River School painters, and he educated his eye and he educated his senses and made the connection, as many people were doing at that time, between the visual beauty that he was seeing on the canvas and what we actually had to protect. And it was through that evolution in his own consciousness that he began to see what steps could be taken, and that's when he turned to his son Gifford and said, I have a career for you if you will take it. And so James, the aesthetic connection to nature is something that we've used a lot, probably without even knowing how important it is in developing the awareness. And it's one of the reasons why I think the artifacts of history are so important. So James plays a big role.
So today, what are you focused on in the environment, areas of environment? Are there any one area that you're focused on?
No, my husband does that.
Okay.
He's the other Pinchot brother, and he has a business in Ecuador. He's trying to pick up where Gifford left off. Gifford I said, private conservation, getting people on private lands to do conservation is too hard. Let's take care of the big chunks first. So my husband Peter is interested in what is that interface between people's economic need and the desire to conserve the forest. So he has a wood business in Ecuador that's trying to link good markets to mixed species forests, so that, because it's so different, usually you just high grade out one species and what's left is not useful. So this is a whole different approach to creating aesthetic designs from mixed species in rainforests that are sellable to people who want to make a difference to the environment.
I think that the problem of tropical forestry is interesting because in a relatively small parcel of land, you might have 300 different species of trees, 20 of which have known commercial value. So what are your choices? As Nancy said, you could high grade just take out the mahogany and so forth. That's not sustainable. What people generally do is cut everything down and then take out the mahogany and then create a plantation later. But what is the way in which you could preserve a robust and diverse forest and still practice forestry? And that's what my brother is working on, and it's a really big challenge. Even things like FSC don't really have a solution in tropical forestry.
Now, your children, you have 3 children?
Yes.
And are they committed environmentalists, and they kind of have the Pinchot family traditions, or they're really doing whatever they want to do?
My son my first son is the director of sustainability and now marketing at Taylor Shellfish. So he's certified all the farms that they have. This is the largest oyster company in the.
All right, well, so he's in favor of sustainability. That sounds like okay in family tradition. What's the other two? Any capitalists or?
My second son is a doctor, so
Right.
I don't know where you place that.
Probably okay, I guess.
And my daughter's work is in social justice, not the environment.
Oh, well, that's okay too. All right, so you don't have anybody who is ruining the environment, right?
Like me.
Well,
Right.
there's me.
Oh.
I'm one of the things one of the challenges we have in recovering people from various wars, one of the things they've discovered is that the worst injuries that happen to people are not the things that happen to them themselves, but the things that they have done to others. And this is called a moral injury, where you've been put in a situation where you had no choice but to, let's say, fire indiscriminately into a crowd of people who were shooting at you, but when you cleaned up afterwards, there were a lot of dead women and children, and you just can't get over it. And so that concept of moral injury actually applies to all of us here today. You asked me the first question, well, you flew here. What do you think about that? I can't live without adding fairly large amounts of carbon to the environment, and I know that what I'm doing is harmful. And that's just part, every time I get into a car, right? I think, I try to walk, I try to take buses, but I do get into cars. And when I do that, I'm harming the environment. We can't help that in our world. We cannot help that. We consume electricity, we do all these things. And so we are all experiencing a degree of moral injury, which is part of what I think is holding down the spirit of enthusiasm that used to characterize this nation.
But when you have a name like yours, do you feel an obligation to kind of be more pro-environment than if you didn't have, if your last name was Rubenstein, you wouldn't have that same feeling, I guess, right?
Well, I guess you do have a feeling, though.
Well, but you have it's part of your tradition, right?
Yes, it's part of my tradition, and the way I've dealt with this is I say there are really three ways of dealing with climate change. There is denial, which may or may not work for you. There's depression, and I've tried that. I got 8 years ago, I got so depressed that I would wake up in the middle of the night with tears on my pillow. And
what are you doing now?
you do something about it. That's the final choice, the third D. As long as you're doing something about it, it doesn't hurt anywhere near as much. And and the more we can become involved in really doing something about the great challenges of our time, the more we recover from the moral injury, which is what the VA tells the soldiers to do: be in service, and you will get better.
Now, philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. Doesn't mean necessarily writing checks and so forth. So. Your family was probably extremely wealthy by the standards of the day and when your grandfather was around. But today, you're probably not in the category of Bill Gates, I guess, right?
Well, first of all, I don't think we were. I think we were in the ultra-rich class, but at the lower end of that spectrum, as opposed.
Not the Vanderbilts.
But now you are not in the ultra-rich, but you're in the modestly okay category. So
I've managed to make it to middle class, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but when people come to you, do people assume that you're going to write big checks, or that you view your contribution to philanthropy now as giving your time and your energy, ideas, as opposed to writing checks, and you feel that's just as good, right? I assume.
Well, if I had millions to give away, I suppose that would be good. But I do what I can, and I'm also obviously working with various nonprofits. I'm involved in raising money also, so that's another thing that you can do in the philanthropic space.
So how do you assuage your philanthropic needs these days? What do you focus on?
Well, this project in Ecuador has pretty much cleaned us out. And that's the contribution that my husband feels the concept of moral injury very deeply as well, and he cannot not do this. So, and I think this is true of both these brothers, that they are so imbued with the idea that they have an obligation to do this, whether it comes from Gifford or from some internal sensitivity or what it is, but they have equally managed to take everything they've got and put it into these, one might even say quixotic projects, because they are disruptive. They go against the mainstream, which is what Gifford did, but they are totally valuable in terms of what they suggest for the future.
So what do you do if people introduce you and they say, this is the Pinchot family? How did you tell them that they don't know how to pronounce the name, or how do you actually come to Pinchot, not Pinchot?
Well, it's Pinchot.
Well,
Pinchot, there's 1,000 other worse variations, so Pinchot is pretty acceptable in my mind.
Okay, so you don't...
I prefer Pinchot to Pinochet, but that's just...
Yeah, there you go. That's a good one.
Okay. All right. And so the best advice you have for somebody that comes from a prominent family that has a tradition of philanthropy, as your family does, is how do you instill in the next generation the family tradition? What's the best way to do it? Teach them early, let them do whatever they want, let them read about it. What do you think is the best way?
Put them in nature. Then it all makes sense. We adopted a child from China who was 5 and who had not literally stepped outside since we got her, and she never really has bonded to nature, whereas our older ones who were in nature from the beginning, one of them is graduated from the Yale School of Forestry and is now a scientist with the Forest Service. The other works for the World Resources Institute. So it's almost like, how do you stop them unless they have no experience of nature? You have to feel it first. And I think that's...
And there's a lot of evidence to back that up. If you go and find an environmentalist, you will find that early in life they had a relationship to nature. And it's very important in early childhood education and in the development of your own children, to make nature something which is fun and so forth, as opposed to the doom and gloom. Doom and gloom is not working very well in selling the environmental movement, and we have to bring the fun back into it.
Are you a big camper? Do you go out in the environment? You're camping out a lot, or you're not a big outdoors type?
I love camping and being outdoors, yes.
Okay. And what do you do about trees in your own house, neighborhood? Do you plant trees, or you're not a big tree planter yourself, given your family tradition of worrying about forestry?
I don't. Where we live is essentially it's a townhouse, but it could be an apartment the way it is situated relative to nature.
You can't plant a tree in the front of it, I guess.
You cannot plant a tree in the front of that. Yeah, and I find that difficult. I have a definition of greenwashing, which is just another way of thing, which is what I get when I run down a path with green pushing over me like this as I'm running through the woods, and I find that restores my soul. And I think that for me, perhaps only because I grew up in nature, or perhaps because it's a universal human need that just gets shut off at early life if you don't experience it. Being in nature is something which I have to do, otherwise I become very unhappy and stressed.
So one thing I didn't mention is, you might describe this, you started a school in the Seattle area that gives a degree in sustainable business practices, is that right? And you might describe what happened, why you did that.
So when after we sold Consensus Development, which was the internet security company that I was the CEO of, we had money, and we figured, what are we going to do? We got to do something to give back to society, and we have a new opportunity to do so. And we looked around and we said, well, what are all the areas? We could work in green investment, but there were lots of good people there. We could work trying to change consumer behavior. There were a lot of people doing that. We could work on trying to change the law. There were a lot of good people doing that. But the business schools were teaching the Friedman principle. They were teaching that it was immoral to do anything for the community, for the environment, for future generations if it took a penny away from shareholders. And as a consultant, I had seen a lot of this behavior. And I thought, and my wife and I thought, this is the area where we can actually make a difference, because nobody is doing this. And we went around to the business schools and tried to talk them into bringing the environment and social justice into the business curriculum, and they laughed at us. And the few faculty members who agreed with us said, don't come here, whatever you do, we're getting killed.
Right.
So
Even Yale didn't want to do it.
So the only thing that we could think to do was to create a kind of a model of what a school that took the environment and the social justice seriously in every course, finance and the triple bottom line, mission-driven marketing, and so forth. And we wanted to prove that A, students would come to such a school, which they did, B, that they would get jobs, which they did, and more important than that, we wanted to transform business education generally. And now there are hundreds of business schools which are giving sustainable business degrees, and our real purpose for being is over. And I was the first, third, and fifth president of the school, illustrating a remarkable lack of talent in the area of succession planning.
You didn't like, you just took the odd numbers, first, third, and fifth? You didn't do, second and fourth, you didn't like even numbers, or?
Well, if you do the second and you're the same person as the first, it's still the first.
Right, I got it.
So.
Okay, so what happens if one of your children or grandchildren were to apply the Yale School of Environmental Sciences? Would they get in automatically, or?
I doubt it.
Really?
Wait a minute, I can testify to the opposite.
They got
Peter, my husband, was he did things backwards. He didn't even have an undergraduate degree, and
They didn't know that, though, Nancy.
yes,
Come
they
on.
did. Yes, they did. And he went to the Yale School of Forestry, got his degree, and then they said, "Oh, whoops, you better go back." And so he did. He took a few extra courses and finished. But that's how much they would let a Pinchot in.
Okay.
Honestly. And then my daughter went to Yale School of Forestry and is now working for the Forest Service. But she did it the proper way, so we can't claim anything there.
All right, well, your family has a very impressive tradition, and I want to thank you for telling your story today, and it's very impressive what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you.